Hi, I'm Lorenzo Piccio, Senior Analyst for Development Finance with Devex. Today we're recapping the top 10 development finance stories and trends of the year. From Ukraine to Ebola, events over the past year have really put donors to the test. Can donors, in a coordinated fashion, really respond to the multiplicity of development challenges that are occurring around the world? Over the past year, Ukraine, of course, has been wedged between Russia and Europe, both literally and figuratively. The government in Kiev is struggling to respond to economic and political challenges. The war in the country's east is costing the government $5 million a day. In a bid to shore up the government in Kiev, Western donors have been pumping billions in foreign aid. We have the IMF giving $17 billion, the EU giving over $15 billion, and the US pledging $1 billion. Earlier this year, Brussels approved a new policy which effectively discontinues bilateral aid to 16 upper middle income countries. These include 3 of the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, and China. The goal here apparently is to get more EU funding to the countries that are poorest and need the money the most. Now if that sounds familiar, that's because the EU is only the latest donor to really adopt this policy. Most recently, we have the UK announced that it will pull out of South Africa and India for very similar reasons. It's been over a year since US President Barack Obama announced his Power Africa initiative. The goal of that program is to double access to energy across sub-Saharan Africa by 2018. And in 2014, we saw the first results from this initiative. For starters, Power Africa is already more than 25% towards its goal of generating 10,000 megawatts of energy for Africa. And at a recent summit in Washington between US and African leaders, we saw billions in additional contributions from the World Bank, from Sweden, from private donors to Power Africa. But as a Devex analysis recently found, turning these commitments into reality will be a much harder task. In fact, of the $5 billion that the President has pledged for Power Africa through Export-Import Bank, that is the bulk of the $7 billion that has been pledged by the administration, they are only at under $50 million in signed deals 1 year into Power Africa. In no small part because they actually need the private sector to assume some of the risk before any of this money actually materializes. This year, the United Kingdom reached its target of committing 0.7% of its gross national income to official development assistance. That has been a milestone target that has been on the books for a very long time. Now, this is critical for various reasons. First of all, the UK is the second largest bilateral donor in the world. The UK donor is also seen as a trendsetter in the aid community. And I think even more critically, the UK is under a conservative-led government. And given what's happening in Australia, for instance, I think the UK has set an example for what's possible when there's political will to back the 0.7 target. But of course, next year in May, we do have an election in the UK. You have a very ascendant UK Independence Party that wants to slash 85% of foreign aid. And you also had the Foreign Secretary recently called the idea of enshrining 0.7 into law bizarre. But I think for now, you really have to give credit to the UK for achieving this very important milestone. Now, while the UK is one of a handful of traditional donors that are really making a concerted effort to boost their aid spending, that is hardly the case among the world's emerging economies. In 2013, the most generous country in terms of ODA to GNI was not the UK, was not the US, was not Germany. It was the UAE, which gave $5.1 billion in foreign aid. We see the same story elsewhere in the emerging economies. India, a 34% increase. Turkey, a 30% increase. Now, I've spoken to officials in Ankara and Moscow, and the message is consistent. They want to stay the course. These countries want to be seen as global players, and to do so, they will have to play their part in global development. For 2015, USAID has set this very ambitious target of channeling 30% of its funding to local groups. We learned this year that they are now more than halfway toward that target. Now, this initiative, part of USAID Forward, has clearly transformed the way that the agency does business. There are some caveats here. First, we don't actually know whether they will hit the target. We are still a year away, so we will know next year whether they do. Second, we looked at the numbers recently and we found that the top 20 local partners for USAID got 43% of their total local spending. And so that's a concern for many experts and implementers who would prefer a much broader local partner base. Nonetheless, there is a growing sense in Washington that localization is sticking and will be the way that USAID does business for the foreseeable future. Next, we have the U-turn in the direction of Australia's aid program. Under Labour, Australia had very clear ambitions of becoming a global donor. In fact, they wanted to double their aid budget by next year. Then came the change of government in Canberra, now under Conservative Prime Minister Tony Abbott. One of the first moves of that government was amalgamate AusAid into the Foreign Ministry. A few months later, they imposed a cap on annual aid spending for Australia. Then they announced over $6.3 billion in cuts in aid spending over the next 5 years. They have also pulled back from Africa and Latin America. We have a saying in American politics: elections have consequences, and for Australia's aid program, that has certainly been the case. In the 5 years since the Green Climate Fund was first conceived, the question you have heard from many NGOs is, where's the money? And for readers who might not know what the fund is, it is supposed to channel a significant share of climate finance over the next decade. But what seemed like a trickle of contributions to the fund over the last few weeks suddenly become a thud. You had the US pledging $3 billion, Japan $1.5 billion, even Australia pitched in with $165 million. China for now has decided not to contribute any money. Now this is important not just because of the money. This is expected to give a big boost to negotiators as they try to hammer out a global climate agreement next year. Earlier this year, the fund decided that it will channel funding on a 50-50 split to adaptation and mitigation. That is welcome news for many advocates who lament the fact that there has been a bias toward mitigation financing these past 2 years. Now, the GCF isn't the only new financing mechanism that we are seeing coming into being. There's also, of course, the launch of 2 new multilateral banks. First, we have the BRICS bank called the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. AIIB, which is led by China, and the BRICS New Development Bank are both expected to have capital at the initial stages of $50 billion and will have a heavy focus on infrastructure. That is sorely needed given the $1 trillion gap we have in infrastructure financing around the world. Now, both banks are almost certain to shake up the multilateral financing landscape, challenging old players like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And finally, we have the top development finance story of the year, that is the Ebola response. We have seen thousands of deaths, communities devastated across West Africa, and rightly so, donors have been responding over these last few months. The US with over 700 million, the World Bank 500 million. We have seen emerging donors like China, India, Turkey step up. Even Facebook came in with $25 million. Already, donors are looking to the next phase of the rebuilding process. According to the World Bank, the economies of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia have lost $2 billion as a result of the epidemic. I think an even more important question here is, how do we prevent this from happening again? And to do so, they will have to invest in rebuilding the health systems of these countries, which as of now get a very, very, very small portion of global health funding.